Hi, my name is Pete Krutoff. I'm the PTL for the OpenStack UX project. What we're going to talk about today is a study we conducted in both November and December 2016. The team members included Denise Gregg, Melvin Hilsman, and Yanetta Hutchinson. So the first thing I want to do is to thank the team for their participation. Um, One of the things you find out about user research if you've done it for a number of years is probably the greatest factor in determining whether the research is going to have an impact on the end product is whether or not the team attends. If they don't attend and they ask you to put the presentation in a SharePoint somewhere, it's a pretty good indication that it's not going to be used. So in this case, we had Epic note takers. People took notes. They are available in Etherpads. We had great attendance during the sessions, and they did help provide feedback on the responses. And this is particularly important because, as a researcher, I actually focus on a lot of different things, including quotas, information needs, things like that. And it prevents me from being an expert in any one thing. So I rely on the teams to help me interpret some of the feedback. And they're also participated in the creation of the presentation. And again, it goes towards, bullet number three, which is, we sat down as a team, talked about what the findings were, and it ended up in this presentation. So again, thank you to the team. There's a couple of assumptions that we did want to mention at the beginning of the presentation. They do have a potential impact on the results. First, we did get good representation of cross companies, right? We had GoDaddy there, Pacific Northwest National Labs, Los Alamos National Labs, Intel. So we got a good diversity of opinion, if you will. We did want to mention that these are mature OpenStack deployments. So there was nobody that were part of the calls that were just getting ready to start using OpenStack, that were, for example, at sort of a testing or proof of concept phase. All of these were mature deployments. And again, that potentially impacts choices around deployment orchestration tools. I wanted to include this quote. I'm not going to read it out loud, but it came from the 2016 OpenStack user survey back in April. And, complaints, if you will, from operators around the deployment process are fairly common. They're not just exclusive to the 2016 OpenStack user survey, but also include previous user surveys as well. So this is clearly an issue for the community, um, and may even have an impact on adoption. Because as you can imagine, if your deployment into a test or proof of concept environment, it may have some impact on your decision to adopt. So the study design. Um, so first of all, why this research matters. And again, we covered this a little bit in the previous slide. So deployment has consistently been identified as an issue by operators, and that's why we're focusing on it. The specific study design is that we identified areas of discussion, including different organizations. We talked about tools, we talked about workflows, pain points associated with deploying OpenStack, and the research areas were selected based on a combination of issues identified in the user survey, feedback from operators, and the project teams. These were one-on-one interviews. They lasted about 45 minutes to an hour. And participants included, or rather, personas included Ray, the cloud operator. And, we had a few people that felt like they were sort of in these combination roles of DevOps and cloud operations. We don't happen to have a DevOps persona, but we certainly saw the role. So notes were taken by the team in an Etherpad. Etherpad is available to the overall community. And the analysis was conducted using MaxQDA. And max QDA is qualitative data analysis. So typically what we do is load up the notes, assign codes, and try to derive meaning from the codes. So the executive summary, relevant information was difficult to find or the information was incomplete, right? And, this is not exclusive to OpenStack documentation and can include content such as blogs or chat rooms. Um, this also includes the difficulty of finding relevant information through Google. So it feels like we're certainly not optimized for Google. And this is an overall theme in the community. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. This isn't a OpenStack documentation problem. This is actually outside of that. Um, the ability to triage using logs was difficult. There was generally too much or too little information. So if they do, um, depending on the different modes of logs that they're in, including debugging, again, either you're not getting enough information to really do anything useful, or you're getting just so much information that's hard to parse. The other thing too that you hear fairly commonly is that error codes provided very little detail. So, there's almost a running joke within the community that um, all error codes seem to say the same thing. Teams tended to use what they know. Teams discussed moving to other tools, but very few invested the time to do so. So again, I mean, we did have a lot of conversations with teams or operators that, they were familiar with other tools. They actually saw the potential benefits to adopting that tool, but we weren't getting a sense that a lot of them were investing the time to do so. And again, it's because they tend to use what they know. There's typically a significant amount of time that's sort of wrapped up into learning a new tool. And as you can imagine, they have other priorities. Um, so teams tended to hire adaptable members with ability to learn. We only had really one participant that mentioned hiring with OpenStack specific skills. One of the reasons is that OpenStack operators are expensive. And something else that a team member threw out there is not only are they expensive, but they're hard to find. Um, and again, they may be using other tools, right? They may have came from VMware and they're moving over to OpenStack, and at that point you can't exactly get rid of your whole team and then hire OpenStack specific skill sets. So let's go over the findings. And again, documentation still matters. Documentation is not current with the release cycle. Um, it seems like it takes too long for updates to land upstream. The current documentation seems to stay within operations team rather than being committed upstream. And the reason we think that's happening again is a couple of things actually. One is there's a certain time sink, if you will, into committing documentation or changes of documentation upstream. Um, and also it takes some learning just to understand how to commit things upstream, right? And if you're an operator, you may not have the time to learn that process. There is no middle ground. So it seems like with the documentation, it's intended for novice users or expert users. But what we heard was people didn't feel like it did a good job of sort of finding the middle ground. And again, operators felt it was hard to find relevant information across OpenStack docs, blogs, etc. And this goes towards optimization for Google, um, which it seems like we don't do a lot of. But we did find that API mature products did have up-to-date content. The other thing too, we may mention this later on. The other thing too that we found was, a lot of our operators are using older releases of OpenStack. And one of the things that they did indicate was um, they were having trouble finding that information because the documentation was currently being updated. Uh, Potentially to the current release. But again, if you're an operator using a previous version, if you will, a previous release of OpenStack, that becomes problematic. So improve logging, trouble getting at the right information. Again, errors are vague. Um, you can only see the request IDs when using debugging mode. And again, similar to docs, it feels like you're either getting just too much information and you're being overwhelmed, or you're getting too little information. Obviously, lots of noise. Um, there was also a tendency that we found for operators to use third-party tools like Logstash. So in some ways, it seems like I don't know if they were avoiding using logs in OpenStack, but it just seemed like they were already using these three third-party tools. Um, I don't know that everyone agrees. I'm not sure that I agree with it either, but one way to think about this is maybe we just optimize our logs to some other open source third-party tool. So we heard a theme around simple deployment that allows for customization. Um, so it needs to meet two different use cases. The first use case really is around highly configurable with more control, or sort of the push a button and magic happens without a lot of control. I think a lot of it is driven by how the enterprise is choosing to adopt OpenStack, whether they really need that control or not. And what we heard from a few operators is that they were looking at Fuel, or they had begun to use Fuel, similar for Juju. Um, but they eventually found that Fuel is too prescriptive and too simple, not really customizable. And so they found themselves having to go off of Fuel to another solution. Operators do need to see what's happening. They need to track modifications. It helps in customization. It also aids in learning. One of the things that we do know, particularly with operators that are doing test environments or proof of concept, is at that point they may want to push a button, right, for installation. But even if they are pushing a button, they do want to see something in the background that allows them to learn how OpenStack is being deployed, right? So if they eventually go into customization, they have a sense of what's happening in the background. Again, they tend to use what they know. Operators tend to have a bias towards orchestration tools if they're currently used within their teams. For a couple of reasons. One, it's what you know. You've made an investment and you know how to use it. Um, Moving to another orchestration tool, may be painful. The other thing that we did here was there was a perception that there were no major differences between tools. Um, so they're not really feeling that motivated to move to another tool. And one of the things I think is particularly relevant is as you can imagine, they have a ton of priorities. They only have so much time. So at that point, you're going to have to sort of stack rank what you want to work on. And it felt like changing orchestration tools sort of fell to the bottom of the list, or was lower on that list, because they already had a solution that was working just fine for them, or it was good enough. However, they did mention that if the tool was well documented, um, in some ways there are no major differences between the tools, and they just need to understand what's being abstracted. So teams hire operators who are adaptable and willing to learn. I think, potentially in the community there's a perception that you have operators um, that are OpenStack specific, potentially hired by their teams to do um, OpenStack specific work. Um, but we were finding that that wasn't the case. They were really hiring operators who were simply adaptable and could move from one solution to another cloud solution um, relatively easy, assuming that they are adaptable and willing to learn new technologies. And again, the team may not have the luxury of specialists, right? If you have an established team, it may be difficult to get a rec to hire somebody who's a specific OpenStack operator. We did find that teams were hiring people with programming skills. One suggestion was that enterprises had adopted a DevOps model. Um, so this is a CI/CD model. It requires, some coding skills, and these kind of go towards the reliability, automation engineers. Another suggestion that was thrown out there is related to the maturity of OpenStack, and we do still have bugs on occasion. And so if you have the coding skills, it enables you to go upstream and submit bugs, for example, or fix things. So teams mentioned that they liked OpenStack Ansible, not all of them, but some of them. Some of them, frankly, were using Puppet Labs or some other solution. Um, in OpenStack Ansible, it removes all of the rolling by hand because it provides things like playbooks or recipes to OpenStack. And, but one of the bad things about OpenStack Ansible was time to deploy. They felt like it was very comprehensive, but also very slow. The reality is, though, is I don't know that any of the operators felt like that was a huge problem, right? As long as, it removed the need to roll by hand. This could easily apply to other deployment tools as well. So I don't know that it's entirely safe to assume that everybody uses Ansible. I don't know that it's a safe assumption that people are willing to move to Ansible if it's compelling enough. Um, Really, I think this is about making existing tools like Puppet, like Chef, um, that are customized for OpenStack. So recommendations, we have a few recommendations. One, of course, is improved logging. I don't think that should be surprising to anyone. If you don't have good logs, you can't triage. If you don't have good logs, you can't figure out what happened with your deployment. Again, improved documentation. This includes, optimized for Google search. Um, you know, Keep the installation content updated for the current release of OpenStack. But it's also important to make content that was specific to a previous release available. Because again, a lot of these deployments or production environments are using previous releases of OpenStack. Deployments should be simple to use, but allow for customization, right? So always assume that there are two different use cases. Um, and the question, in my opinion, is how do you meet both use cases in one experience? What does that look like? Is it a graphical user interface like Fuel, but it also gives you kind of a sense of what's happening in the background, or it generates, if you will, um, things like recipes in the background that you can go and customize. So the recommendations also is to use current orchestration tools and customize them for OpenStack. We talked about that a little bit previously. And again, it's because teams tend to use what they know. And it may be different again for enterprises that are just beginning to investigate OpenStack. And again, do not assume OpenStack specific experience. So as you create these tools, don't assume that these operators have an incredibly deep knowledge of OpenStack. They're just learning in some cases. So thanks. I appreciate it. Again, I really appreciate the help of the team. I don't know we could have gotten through this without their feedback and maybe some clarification on the comments that were coming from operators. So again, it was a good team. And thanks for watching this presentation.